continuing our whirlwind tour of the software as a service technology stack. The next chunk of things is HTML and CSS. Again, this is something probably a lot of people have sort of seen or they know by osmosis, but we're going to give you the highlights. And in terms of our big picture, we kind of just finished talking about the top tier of client-server, HTTP, and so on, and we're now moving on to one more level of detail, which is how do you represent the stuff that the browser is asking for? So very simply, a markup language or a way to format some content is the difference between something like this, which can be marked up like that, to look like that. OK, that's your entire training. I'm kidding. I'm kidding. I'm kidding. So HTML, a lot of you have probably sort of informally seen. It actually descends from a language that IBM developed in the 60s so that different projects in different departments could exchange information in a portable manner. And IBM's version of it became codified as an open standard in the 80s. So it's very simple. A document is a hierarchical collection of elements, headings, tables, things like that. Things can be embedded like images or JavaScript. We'll see examples of that. Forms that users can fill out a form and submit some input and cause the server to do something. Elements have attributes and can be nested inside each other. Now, I could say all that, or we could just look at an example, which makes it much easier. Let's head over to Firefox here. Hello World is not a very interesting example. But the Computer Science Division homepage is not too bad. So I'm going to, there we go, web developer. I'm going to view source from Firefox. And by the way, let me take this moment. This is also in one of the screencasts, but something you really want in Firefox is the web developer toolbar. If you're doing anything non-trivial with web development, you absolutely need this. OK. Here's the underlying HTML of this page. And you know, it's kind of, you can map elements pretty easily, right? Here's an element called title. That's what the title of the window is supposed to be, Computer Science Division. Here is a table with a bunch of rows that is trying to get all of these menu choices, EEX overview, and so forth. But you know, what's kind of important to notice about this, they've indented the elements here to make it easier to read, although indentation isn't part of HTML. But you can see that for every opening tag, so here's an opening TR, somewhere there's going to have to be a close tag TR that matches it. And that's, yep, there it is, right? So everything inside the tag is collectively the contents of the element. Some elements, like this anchor, have some content, right? So the anchor has an attribute, the href attribute, which tells where the link is going to go, but the actual content is the thing that appears on the screen. So that's that. Right? So more detail in the book. That's the very general idea. Elements are nested. They can have attributes. Of particular interest among the attributes is the ID and class attributes, which were introduced 2 or 3 years after HTML sort of made its debut on the big stage, because this is now the preferred way to apply visual formatting to a page. So let's very briefly talk about how that works. And that is cascading style sheets. So the idea behind CSS is that you separate the visual appearance of the page from the logical structure of the page. You put them in completely separate documents. And there's a lot of reasons you might want to do this. One reason that a lot of people actually don't always think of is accessibility. For people who have visual impairments or other impairments, keeping the structure and content of the page completely free of any decorations or gingerbread makes it easier, for example, for screen reading software to figure out what the logical pieces of the page are. Branding or targeting. You might want to have essentially the same page or the same service, but if you're offering it to different customers, those customers might want to make it look more like to match their branding, and I'll show you an example in a moment. And also, if you're working in a team where the developers and the designers are not the same people, it provides a pretty nice way to separate their concerns and let them work independently. So as a really simple example of that, I've got a couple of other browser tabs open here that we can look at. This is a site that I actually run. This is, if you ever want to see great community theater in Alameda, talk to me. This is the ticket buying and customer relationship software which I wrote. It was kind of my gift to them. This tab is the same software running for a different theater, a San Francisco one, which I also really like. And they're opening a great show this week. Ask me about it. But what's interesting about these two is that these are actually the same site. The only difference between these two is that the styling is different. CSS is different. Going back to our friend the developer toolbar, if we turn on display element information, we could see that when we hover over different elements, you see the red outline, and in this kind of upper white bar right here, you see the entire page hierarchy of what's going on with that element. So right now, I've got a red box around custom-made theater company, and you can see that that box is an H1 element. It's inside a div, it's inside another div, and so forth, all the way up to HTML, which is the top level. Absolutely invaluable for troubleshooting stuff. So, how does this actually work? As with so many things in this class, at a basic level, it is really, really simple. And by the way, best practice, and I'll show you an extreme example, is your HTML markup that comes out of your app should have nothing in it about styling. All of the styling should be done separately in CSS. And if you think that's limiting, in a moment I will show you why it's not. So how does it actually work? Well, one thing you have to do is associate the page with the styling information. And you'll see at the top of every page that uses CSS, somewhere there'll be a link element that has the URI of the style sheet. So the style sheet is just another URI. It's another thing on the web that your browser can ask for. And within the page, there's many different ways that you can select a chunk of the page and say, here's how to make this chunk look. The book talks about a number of them, but a particularly important one that you'll see very commonly is the ID and class attributes that you can attach to HTML elements. Right? The ID is an attribute that, if it exists, has to be unique within a page. So I have a div element here whose ID is the string right. There can't be anything else on that page with the same ID, whether it's a div or some other kind of element. A class can be attached to many different kinds of elements, even of this different types on different pages. And one of the most straightforward ways that you can select elements for styling is by attaching IDs and classes to them and then referring to those IDs and classes in your CSS file. So, for example, given this little snippet of HTML up at the top, there's various ways that I can select parts of that page so that I can describe how to make them look. For example, I could say, apply styles to all H1 tags. That's kind of a sledgehammer, but I could do that. I could say any element whose class is page frame, and dot is the notation for doing that. So for example, that top div, class equals page frame, would be picked up by this selector. I could also do it by the element's ID, which has to be unique on a page. # is the syntax for that. So looks like, in fact, both of these selectors would equally well match that div. By the way, don't do this. This is an example for illustrative purposes, but the message is you can easily end up writing selector names that can match in multiple ways, and the rules for who wins are complicated and are not always consistent from one browser to another. So keep it simple. A combination of tag name and class. So any div with class page frame, or a span whose ID is cust name. By the way, this is redundant, right? Because ID has to be unique on a page, so I could just omit the word span from here, and there's at most one element is permitted to match this, right? By definition, assuming it's a legal page. Yes?
There's actually a case where that would not be redundant if you use the style sheet for multiple pages and on different pages you have different things with the same ID.
Yes, okay, so Richard points out correctly that if I use the same style sheet to apply to multiple pages, on different pages, so I could have another page where there's an H1 tag whose ID is cust name, and as long as within that page this ID is unique, the selector won't match it. So yes, that's true. And it is very common to have a single style sheet that's used kind of across an entire site. So that's a good point. Thanks, Richard. Okay, so given that overview of CSS, which admittedly was brief, let's see if, oh wait, I didn't describe the bottom one because I was correcting myself. Descendant relationship. This one's actually pretty important because it's more selective. So if I have one selector followed by spaces followed by another selector, that means first look for this, and then inside of it, look for that. Okay, so the particular example on the slide is look for a div, any kind of div, doesn't matter what kind, and inside of that div, look for something that has the class cust name. Right, so in this case, well, there's a div. It's the outermost element. And you can see on the fourth line, there's, oops, that's a typo. I'm going to have to fix that. That should have said span class equals cust name for the purposes of the example. When you guys can make a note, I'll fix that. But the idea is that you would match the span element with that class, but only if it occurred inside of a div. And either of these could be as specific as they wanted. Right, so it's a way to select based on the relationship of descendants in HTML as opposed to just based on tags and classes and so forth.